Dell Armi, the Bolognese podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition. Today's guest is Devon Boorman of Academie Duello.
Mr. Boorman, how are you doing, sir?
Hey, doing well. Good to see you.
Hey, Devon.
Great to have you back on.
Hey, good to see you, Steven.
All right, so Devon, we brought you on for our episode today because we wanted to talk to you about sword and small buckler.
Awesome.
One of the core quintessential pieces of the Bolognese system. So we knew that you were the man to talk to here, especially after your demonstration at Western Martial Arts Weekend, which we can link a video to, or the Bolognese Weekend. It was that, right? It was the Bolognese Weekend?
That I did the assault.
Yeah,
for what I'm talking about, Western Martial Arts Workshop. It was the what did they call that? I can't remember.
I think it was a night at the Opera Nova.
Oh, that's right, night at the Opera Nova.
That's right. But an appropriate title, right? Because you just fit in anywhere with that one. So obviously, despite your being a fantastic teacher, an instructor, and sort of a world-renowned instructor, you're also an awesome sword and small buckler person, and so you fit perfectly with this material. So, do you want to get into the first question there, Steven?
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea, Joshua. All right, Devon, how do you see the sword and small buckler material fitting into the Bolognese system of fencing?
Well, certainly we see, it's like, I think we have to think about each of these different masters that we put into the Bolognese umbrella, as their, I think to a degree, as their own separate people as well, and that each of them has, Morozzo definitely is, leads very forward with the sword and buckler, and Manciolino as well, but Dalla Gocchie, less so, more of a, and even Manciolino a little less so than Morozzo or the Anonimo. So, but I think obviously we see in that time there's sword and small buckler seems to be a very central weapon to the class of people that they're teaching and that they fit into. So I think one thing that's interesting, I was chatting with Marco Quarta about Bologna now, and he says it's still pretty common for people to have a stick and buckler in their house just for self-defense.
Yeah, we've been trying to reach out to him. Really? We've been trying to reach out to Marco to talk to him about this.
And so I thought that was a really interesting thing to hear about, and that was something pretty common for a long period of time, that a small, having a small shield, and you think of it from a utility perspective, that, a little shield makes a sword a lot more safe at the very least. Yeah. Also, I think, obviously this isn't the case for the Bolognese as far as skill, but, one thing of having a shield is it does mean that you, from just a utility perspective, you don't necessarily need to be as skilled as you do with just a stick or just a sword. Though one argument I'd make around small buckler over large shields is large shields impede the wielder so much more significantly than small shields do. But they also, to me, the large shield is a much better thing in a chaotic battle situation where people are not necessarily as heavily trained. And that's what we certainly see. Larger shields play a role in a lot of sort of larger group encounters. Whereas small shields, we see them more in this kind of civil defense environment. And so they also lend themselves to environments where there's a little bit more control over the environment. I'm not kind of concerned that I'm going to be shot at by an arrow from over here or attacked from somebody over there. Right. I kind of have a better sense of where my opponents are. And the small shield allows for greater maneuverability of your sword. It doesn't impede the sword as much, so it does give you more room to be a skilled swordsman. Whereas in a lot of ways, no matter how skilled a swordsman you are, when you're carrying a kite shield or even an imbracciatura to get kind of into the Bolognese vein, it does impede the sword work that is possible. Or even in the rotella, like the rotella's assaults are much simpler than the sword and buckler assaults, and a lot of that is because the rotella takes up a lot of space.
So would you say that the larger the defensive object, the more it's suited for somebody who's poorly skilled, and the less you need, then the more skilled you have to be to use it?
And I think also the environment is that when I have an environment where, when you have larger melee situations, the skill of the individual swordsman also becomes less relevant. And so having a weapon that is suited to when skill is less relevant is also something to think of for the larger shield. Now, that's kind of one theory that I think there's a lot of ways we see that play out. Yet, back to this having a sword and buckler in your home, the buckler also has this utility of being small, being portable, being something you can carry on your belt or you can have tucked behind your door, and you can pick it up very easily and put it to immediate use, immediate service. Whereas, you don't, I imagine if somebody breaks into your home, you can grab the stick and the buckler. It's a lot harder to be like, I'm going to go strap on my kite shield. Hang on.
Got it. So it's kind of like your 9mm, which you can just have sort of sitting in the dresser versus your 50 cal, which just takes a little bit of setup time. Also, we should remember that, go ahead.
And we do see that with, as far as like the buckler being a portable shield, which is the same thing of the side sword, even this term that was spotted elatto that we use of meaning, which has this sort of calque, it is a sidearm. That is the weapon you can carry versus the weapon that it is the weapon that you can carry in a portable fashion as opposed to the weapon that you actually have to literally carry like a rifle or that you carry alongside you or that you pack onto your transport. And then you take off when you get to the place that you're going to use it. I think the buckler fits into that same sidearm category. It's something that you take with you more easily. And so I think, to me, the reason I think it's very forward in a lot of the Bolognese material is because those are people that are selling their art to a particular audience, and that audience is interested in that. And there's a bunch of circumstances of civil defense, of a certain amount of skilled swordsmanship, perhaps, that lead that to being the more marketable item. And I think that, from the way that people talk about it in their books and the fact that we know that these were professionals who were selling their services in a different way than people who were sword masters to patrons, as we have with some, or were noble in some circumstance themselves, that changes the nature of what they're presenting. And I think it's just market pressures are part of what puts that system Interesting. Now, I don't just mean market pressures in what you're going to get paid for, but also in what the demand is to learn a particular thing.
Right, so it's kind of like teaching on the streets versus teaching to a nobleman who hires you to be his private tutor.
Right.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting too. So I was reading. There's a book called A Society of Violence in Bologna, and it covers from 1200 up to about 1600. And one of the things that I was talking about in this book was actually that you had to get basically a concealed carry permit to carry a sword or even carry a defensive implement like a buckler or something like that in the city.
Right.
And it was actually a really exclusive thing. I thought that was interesting.
It is interesting. So
when I was reading, I went when I was doing research for my rapier book, I was looked through a whole bunch of different laws around weapons carries in Italy, in a bunch of the different city-states, what I could find on that. I looked through a bunch of the Tudor laws from England, and there were prohibitions. It was notable to me there were prohibitions against bucklers as much as there were prohibitions against daggers and swords. So I thought that was notable.
Well, when you're counter to anything involving somebody trying to go for a press or something like that is to basically punch them with the rim of the buckler, you start to feel a little bit that it can be as offensive as defensive.
It's not a buckler, it's a pot lid that I'm carrying outside of my house right now. You never know when you're going to come across a pot of boiling water that you have to cover.
That's right.
Right.
All right. So how would you approach the teaching of sword and small buckler as different from sword and large buckler or sword and targa?
Well, I think we have touched on that a little bit at the kind of the outset of this. When the small buckler, to me, swordsmanship is much more forward. Meaning the actual sword side of the equation is more forward in the teaching than it is when we get to larger shields that take up more of that space and thus simplify the swordsmanship that's possible. Or not necessarily, meaning it's possible while maintaining the defense of the shield.
Right.
I can always put my shield behind me and do whatever I want with my sword. But that also takes away a lot of the benefit. The thing that I love about small buckler that I think is so notable about it is that I can keep it very present while continuing to do a lot of work with my sword. I still have a lot of tactical possibilities with the sword while still having the cover and added control that the small buckler gives me, in the way that the small buckler kind of enhances the defense of the sword itself.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense. So it's kind of the swordiest. The small buckler is sort of the swordiest of them all.
That's right. It's you get to put up the sword meter while having a little bit less on the defense, the buckler meter. And so when I would say, I used to teach sword and buckler together immediately. So you actually had the buckler in your hand right away. We taught everything. Right. If you didn't have a buckler, we didn't have enough in the school, you put an arm out in front of you with a fist. And still did the stuff. I have since then spent more time with sword alone because I do find that it is a benefit for when you're working with a small buckler to have good sword alone skills, and because there's a lot of room. And then we add to it the small buckler, and then the first things that I'm teaching is how do you keep doing the sword alone things you've done while maintaining the presence of the buckler. And so that's kind of the stage that we work there. Whereas when I teach larger shield work, we will, in some ways, we'll have the large, I might, again, most of my students are going to come with some sword work background already, but if I was doing a workshop, I might teach them just basic cuts with the sword and then bring the shield in right away because it's going to be a much more co-equal partner to that relationship because it's always occupying so much more space. And so then we'll be really looking at how, we're immediately working within the limitations of that shield. And so that has such a much more central role. Whereas to me, the small buckler, it's really more like how do you maneuver the buckler in such a way that it doesn't limit the sword and only enhances it.
So this is what I'm wondering. Would it be fair to say that just to go with this real fast, would it be fair to say that the sword and small buckler is actually swordier than the sword by itself because you can actually do so much more with it because your hand is protected?
So, one thing that you mentioned the video from WW. There's another WW video of me and Rob Rutherford doing an exhibition bout at Sword and Buckler and Sword Alone. And one thing that's notable, I think, that I just mentioned next, it's a video you could grab. When somebody's fighting sword alone, and, Manciolino makes that explicit thing that you throw half blows. And, that is, as you're mentioning, is to keep the sword in front of you. So it certainly does limit. I think that it ends up pushing things a little bit more towards a gioco stretto type space. Right. And I mean gioco stretto not in going into prese, but gioco stretto meaning the presence of the points and the proximity of the weapons.
Right.
And then when you have a buckler, and you see this in our fight, as soon as we have the buckler, suddenly we're, much broader guards. We're using more gioco largo because the buckler does provide protection for the sword hand, but also protection for your body when you're moving through larger actions. So there's a certain way that it is swordier, but I'd say it's more largo. There's more room for playing between largo and stretto. There's a greater breadth of options that you will have available to you safely, or more safely than you would with sword alone, where, I would advocate, just as some of the historical masters do, to be more conservative when you're fighting sword alone.
Yeah, I agree with that. I kind of think back to, again, kind of bringing up Manciolino's advice. Also, like what you were saying, him telling you not to leave the low guards when you're in an earnest fight, right? And he's talking about, and you see that when he actually describes fighting with a sharp sword, which comes from the sword and large buckler section or the sword alone section, then you don't leave low guards. You're hanging out in Porta de Ferro Stretta or Codalunga Alta, and you're just kind of progressing the fight from there. So how do you see, in terms of like the dichotomy of those two things, right? Because there is that sort of fine line between, it seems like the sword and small buckler is always associated with having like a non-sharp sword, right? You're fighting with a practice weapon in some way. And, Manciolino gives his nice allegory at the beginning of his chapter where he's talking about how, no one can achieve victory without grace, and talking about the nymphs as sort of the true allegory of what that wide play style of fighting looks like. And then you get into later prose, and he's talking about with Ajax and Odysseus, and the difference between their speech, and how even though Odysseus was definitely the better orator, but you have Ajax, who actually knew the spirit of his men because he was like hardened and fighting alongside them, and he actually understood where they were coming from, where he kind of saw Odysseus more as this character that was sort of removed from that in a way. He was a lot more of a noble character, and therefore he was a great orator, but he wasn't Ajax. He wasn't the one that was just going to the front of the lines and fighting. And so he uses that as almost a metaphor to take it into the sharp weapons, where there's almost like this different feel that you start to get with the sharp weapons. How do you see those two things really kind of play out as you're kind of reading through the text, and how do you view changing the strategy between those two things?
Between spada di gioco and spada di filo, kind of meaning, and within a buckler context?
Yeah, and also like how so I guess asking to really just kind of expand on what you were just talking about, where the difference between that small buckler and that large buckler mentality.
And between sharps and Sala swordplay. Yeah, I think, there is that same thing that seems to come between just, whether it's with a secondary or not, between spada di gioco and spada di filo, and this change of attitude that's required for those two modes. There's a part in Marozzo where he talks about that it's like you could void the leg here, but that wouldn't be very interesting. There's a section where he says something like that. And I think that is speaking also to the spada di gioco, that there is a need for doing something that's interesting in spada di gioco, which is speaking a little bit to the social pressure or to what fighting is about there. I think it's one thing to think about, and I'm kind of taking an obtuse angle at your question, but right now, one thing that comes up in our modern world of this martial practice is that there is no place where we go and fight with sharps. And so the conversation of whether it's important to be interesting or efficient is kind of merged sometimes into the same spaces.
Right.
In a way that there was, the display fighting place, and even because actually the reality is that even duels with sharps were display fighting places in a certain manner as well. But it's just, I just think it's difficult for us to even experience. I can think now, I can say, okay, in our school, we're really seeking to do this as a martial art. And we're not, tournaments are a tool for us to help develop ourselves as complete martial artists, etc. So we can say that, and we try to embody that idea. But even that being said, we don't have the same social pressures that they did. So even when we're trying to do something that is recreating a duel, we try to create our own social pressures. Certainly people in the group are like, oh, that person just, hand sniped their way through that, boring. That person there was, did such beautiful actions, and oh, that was gorgeous. That way they did that disarm. That's, some more social cred for that person. So we can have that kind of pressure within our school, but there was never a risk that somebody was going to die there. That's so there wasn't that. We can maybe bring this other social thing, the being able to perform things that are beautiful in a dueling context where somebody could actually die is different than in just the social pressure non-lethal display. And yet also then when we get into a tournament, we try to make, many people try to say that they were trying to make tournaments like the high pressure live and die situation. Yet it isn't. It's yet its own, like I'd say we should look at our tournaments and look at medieval tournaments if we want to have a better sense of kind of that environment of non-lethal. Although medieval tournaments were also more lethal than our tournaments are.
We need to get rid of face masks. It's the face masks.
I mean,
somebody's going to snap at your face without a mask. It gets your attention for sure.
Yeah, so I think this is the thing that I'm getting at here is when we think about what's the difference between sharps play and historically when we look at it, there's a few different modes. There is a type of sharps play which is you are fighting in the street and this is just survival. That is not a noble on the other side who is that you are there as part of a larger social encounter. There's that type of sharps play, and we see some stories and ideas communicated about what the attitude is you need to bring in the battlefield, which is different than the attitude and the comportment. You think of all of Morozzo's second book on how to comport oneself in a judicial duel. That's a different environment, yet again, that can still have a lethality to it, but it's like social plus lethal. And so then I think there's still a different pressure that they're a different way. I think that they're fighting in a fight on the street is going to be different again to a sharps, but in a duel, judicial or extrajudicial duel, versus play in the salle for fitness and exercise and to preserve the vitality of life, to kind of paraphrase Manciolino, and martial display. We are doing in the piazza display. We're doing it at a social event display, which is yet another type of environment. And I feel that there's writing, there's commentary, not as direct as we might want, but there's commentary on all of those things in the manuals, to speak to these kind of different approaches based on those, I've kind of outlined 4 different environments. And I think that it does get more conservative as it gets more violent. As it gets more risky, it gets more conservative, it gets simpler, it gets, down to, like to think of the Bolognese area, but, Fiore saying essentially that there's no more counters than the third countermaster. There's like a countermaster and a countermaster, and that's it. It never, that I think is important to kind of the street fighting world, that you're just going to do something with violence and vigor, and it'll be simple. And then as it gets more social influence comes into it, the greater the social importance, the more the display, and the less conservative, the more it becomes important to use the noble blows that leave you more exposed. That kind of thing, I think, as the social factor increases.
I do see that there's still a level of posturing with Manciolino in particular. So just since that's where my head's at, I'm going to stick with Manciolino.
Yeah.
But with the way that he approaches this sword and large buckler, his approach is that stringere of space, that initial gather into measure that's forcing your opponent to react or to retreat. And if they retreat, they're shamed. And you're basically showing a bit of bravado where you're gathering into measure in guard and saying, I dare you to attack me, right? And the whole principle and precipice of what he's doing is that he's giving you very sound defensive actions that you can play off of based on how your opponent decides to attack you. And of course, they're limited in their attack, which makes it, harder for your opponent. Whereas, I think a lot of times when people look at sword and large buckler, they think of sort of the posturing aspect really coming from the flourishes and from the embellishments, and you're showing your skill. And I think that there's perhaps a level of both. One of the experiments that I've been running with one of my training partners is we'll go between doing both, where we'll approach all of Manciolino's sword and large buckler plays by doing both sort of wide measure, very like we're flowing through the guards as we're approaching one another, and then we'll just kind of have our sword down, very like hulked over shoulders, just posturing at one another as if we were in a street fight, and then just gathering whenever we want, just sporadically gathering in a measure to draw the reaction out of our opponent, just to see, the two things. One, you develop the flow coming in, and two, you're just kind of trying to get that visceral reaction from your opponent. And it's really fascinating trying to draw that visceral response out of somebody, especially in a sparring scenario when they're not expecting it. Because if you're giving that really flowing, nice show of your ability to sort of use arms, they recognize your skill, and then all of a sudden you show them this stillness, and then all of a sudden you explode at them, and they're just like, oh, whoa, this is terrifying.
Yeah, well, the one thing though is I don't know that I feel anything in Menchilino is really written for the street fight. I think all of it is written for dueling or sala fencing. I think there's earnest fencing in there, but I don't feel like it doesn't. I think that there's things we can gather from it about how he might approach a street fight or a fight for his life in a different, less noble context. I think part of that is because that's what the audience is looking for, that he's writing to. I don't think there's a lot of books to be sold. Like there, honestly, right now, even as in modern martial arts, there's not a lot of books to be sold on or workshops to be sold just on how do you survive a brutal street encounter, because it's a pretty small discussion.
So, what do you think do you think any of the Bolognese authors are writing for that sort of situation?
I think that there's good content in all of them for dealing with that situation, but I don't think that any of them are. I know. I know like your thoughts, Stephen, on like that the Anonimo is more like a death dealing oriented text, but there's so much in it, and that's way more. Right. Again, like I think it's way more than you need. Yeah. If that's and so again, I think there's stuff to get out of there, but it's not even like the books start with or end with. I suppose there's a little bit of like, Manchilino has kind of his universal parry section,
right.
Is a little bit maybe that kind of idea of that I'm just making this low inside position, and then I make a thrust out from that, an imbricata out from that, and then I come back to that position, which is what we see maybe in that's probably the most common how you deal with. But I don't even know that universal parry idea, which is also like in Vigiani and is in Capoferro and is in Fiore, I don't even know that idea is an idea for fighting thug on street. I feel like that's like unskilled noble going into duel.
This would be more like, are you thinking then like Docellini would be an example of somebody who's writing for fighting in the streets? Because it's pretty pared down.
There's certainly more to it there, although I still feel like I feel like that's also like Agrippa's also really pared down too, but he's clearly writing for dueling. He's just writing to how the dueling is changing. That's hard to say whether paring down. I think paring down is also something that's happening within thinking at that time. There's a little bit more of a move towards, at least that's what Agrippa's trying to bring in there, is a sort of move towards an engineering level of elegance.
Right.
So I think that's more to do with like purity of thought than it is to do with utility.
Okay. All right, that makes sense.
That's my off the cuff kind of.
That'd be
really
interesting.
Like cool things. Yeah. Like I feel like, man, we should this is a research project worthy kind of subject.
Yeah.
And we should I'd want to go through a lot of things passage by passage to really.
It'd be interesting to look at the masters on this sort of continuum of, survival versus social and kind of like place them there to get to sort of, because a lot of what we're doing right now is sort of trying to understand how they practice the martial arts in the context of their time, which is a lot about the history of that time. And it'd be interesting to look at, what techniques were they using, that sort of thing.
So an interesting note here. Devon, I don't know if we talked about this last time. We may have. But the only time that Marazzo ever mentions the word death or murder in his text is in his dagger section, in his fifth book. He says, if somebody's trying to murder you with a dagger, and that's the only sort of real, like, real deadly thing that Marazzo talks about. And of course, you get the sense of that because somebody's trying to stab you with a dagger, and that sounds terrifying. But in terms of the fencing, like you were saying, I mean, it does seem that most of this is all Sal oriented. So,
well, and again, I think it's, like I've even, the Marazzo's dagger section is such a funny kind of like hodgepodge of greatest hits, that
he's just copying Fiore.
Right, and I feel like, and also meaning those actions show up in a lot of places, in different European texts, because there's some pretty fundamental kind of ideas of the rondel daggers, but I feel like it is, again, where I say it's kind of this greatest hits. One of my thoughts on that is, again, he's selling a book, he's selling teaching, and one thing a martial arts person needs to be able to say is, like, oh, and what if you're assaulted by some peasant on the street? Don't worry, I've got that too. I can. Don't worry, this is a real martial art. It also has daggers.
And for people of a certain class, the daggers on the street were more dangerous than swords. There's
Absolutely.
a lot of people who have money generally are more likely to be killed by a dagger than they are to die in a battle.
Right.
Well, and you can, going back to what we had talked about before with the whole, needing a permit to have a sword or a buckler in the streets of Bologna, you can easily conceal a dagger, but you can't really conceal a sword.
Right, and you also have reason to carry a dagger. They were considered to be utility as well as as weapons.
And Devon, it's totally okay now to admit that Marazzo probably plagiarized Fiore, given that we've found so much information that ties Marazzo to Fiore's text. So we've got Lanceolato Beccaria, who was one of Fiore's named students, ended up basically putting the Bentivoglio in power in Bologna. And so that's one link of Fiore into the city of Bologna. And the other one, of course, is that Guido Rangoni spent a considerable amount of time in Ferrara. So we think that we're fairly certain at this point.
Had a chance to read Fiore, one of Fiore's texts.
Yeah, because his uncles were trained as knights in the city of Ferrara,
right,
by the Dieste family. So that would kind of bring that information back in. So we're starting to get a lot of context clues to really start putting those threads in there. So we on this podcast, at least, we feel very comfortable with saying that.
He took the good stuff out of Fiore and came up with other stuff that's better because it's Bolognese.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the thing, especially when it comes down to dagger things, though, having done a bunch of different knife systems, modern knife systems as well, and I've done Southeast Asian martial arts, a lot of those ideas show up there too, and so that's. Like if you were to ask a bunch of martial arts practitioners, especially if you gave them a weapon that was a, thrusting oriented dagger and said, okay, write down a bunch of grappling techniques, there'd be a lot of similarities. And so it'd be hard for me to say, oh man, all these guys read Fiore. I feel like that there would be, especially if I just grab some particular corpus, that would be easy to make that.
That would be a fun thing to bring up next time. Like, scour the world for actually unique dagger defense moves.
Fiore traveled all over the world.
All right,
that's right. That's definitely what we're going to conclude. We're going to conclude that they're all ripping off Fiore.
All right, we should probably move on here. All right, so Devon, you're kind of on the taller side as fencers go, it'd be reasonable to say, and pretty athletic. How might this change your approach to fencing compared to somebody else?
Somebody who's short and unathletic?
Yeah, exactly. Or somebody who's short and athletic, or somebody who's,
right.
Any of the permutations thereof.
The main difference between short and tall is that you have to be very aware of the moving between, kind of, I call it bridging, or I was just still kind of from Bruce Lee. Was that I can stand in a place for many opponents where I can hit them and they can't hit me, and so they still need to bridge into my distance in order to present threat. But a shorter fencer sometimes has to do that kind of twice. They have to get through my distance. They have to safely transition across this place where I can hit them and they can't hit me, and then they need to transition again into the next distance where they can hit me, but of course I can still hit them.
Right.
And so that's something that I work with when I'm working with, and this is the thing, and I think sword and buckler is a really beautiful combination for that, because you can create a lot more of a a tactical constraining space using the sword and buckler together. And so you can use that to allow you to get through that first danger place, to get through and just make your first objective has to do with bridging that distance and getting into a position of control that you can use to earn the time not to strike, but to bridge the next distance and increasing your control more greatly. So that's kind of, I think, that the main thing that a shorter fencer needs to be considering, and we'll worry about athletic here in a moment, but a shorter fencer needs to think they cannot be as anxious as maybe a taller fencer can afford to be a little more anxious, rush to the attack a little earlier. Like to quote a later master, Fabris teaches a bunch of things about stringere, and then he says, oh, but if you're taller, you don't need to worry about stringere. Just use your reach, right? Like there is...
Okay.
So there is some truth to that. Now, I think all tall fencers should learn to control, because then they've got tremendous power to them, right? But the shorter fencers may be in the beneficial position that to get good, they're going to have to control. They cannot rely on just being able to outreach their opponent. So they're going to be, those good fencers who are shorter are going to be way better fencers, but they've got to be less anxious, more oriented towards control, less oriented towards hitting. They need to be more oriented towards getting first control and then getting greater control. And I think the Bolognese text gives lots of, for those who are studying a Bolognese system, which really teaches to compound intentions very early. Well, I don't know if they did, but they certainly present compound intentions in the manuals very early. That idea, I often think of, my goal is not to hit them 4 times in a row. I'm using these different actions in order to allow me to cross these distances to get into a place where I can't help but hit them.
Yeah.
Now, on the athletic versus non-athletic side, if you are quicker, strong, let's talk about quicker first. So if you're quicker than your opponent, so you can get into the distance, very, very fast. The thing is, you can take away your opponent's capacity to get away from you without having to have timing, right? So very fast people can be less reliant on timing, because they can strike you before you're just even if you see them coming, you're physically just not able to get out of that distance, perhaps. And so when you're less fast, then you need to be more aware of timing. You need to be more aware of taking moments from your opponent where they cannot get away from you. So if you're short and slower than your opponents, this is all relative. Everybody's got somebody taller and faster out there.
Right.
There are students in my school that are taller and faster than me, as frightening as that sounds. And so, just for those who are listening, I'm 6'4". I have a couple students here who are 6'6". One of them is like another 2 inches or 3 inches broader than me. He's just a monster of a guy. And so, I get to feel some of that side of the equation too. And so everybody out there is going to have that. So when you are relatively less reaching and less quick than your opponent, then you need to be really thinking about how you're bridging those distances, and you need to be really using your opponent's movements against them. You need to draw them into you. You have to have them come and join the fight. And then you need to take away, so if I'm shorter and slower, I've got to lure my opponent into making a very committed entry action towards me that I can take away to essentially counter enter. So I might, as a shorter fencer, be teasing the edge of that measure, trying to get that person to make a larger commitment. And I think one thing you have to watch out for is this is when Stephen even talked to me about this at one point, about people who just run away from you a lot. If you lure somebody somebody might run away from you because they're timid. They might run away from you because they're taller, because they know I can keep you at this perfect distance and I'm just going to keep you there. If you lure that person to enter on you, if you, on the first sign of them giving you a little bit of entry, you try to jump all over that, they will never give you that again. So you have to actually ignore their first little forays, so that they get impatient and feel a greater need to go in larger than that, to go in a little bit deeper, and that's the one you take.
Yeah. The Anonimo, Marazzo, and Manciolino all give that advice, right? They all say that if you have an opponent that wants to run away from you, you should basically retreat before them until they gain the confidence that you can then counterattack them. And I think all three of them basically say the same thing.
In some manner or another,
Marazzo gives his analogy of if you fight against a fighter who only knows Larga, then they'll basically run away the entire length of the cell.
Exactly.
But the Anonimo and Manciolino both agree that you should basically retreat until you give them the confidence that they're gonna come in on you.
Except you should also never retreat.
Right.
Well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think one thing I do often equate those things to dancing. The person needs to come and dance with you. I often call it joining. They need to come and you need to find some way to get them to come and participate with you. When they're denying participation, then it's a much more challenging game, especially if you can't just outreach or outspeed your opponent.
Well, I find this interesting too, right? Because in some way, even the people who want to run away, a lot of times, like you were saying, it's kind of built off the pressure of you giving them some sort of, whether it's with your footwork and your distance or something along those lines, you're the one that's kind of driving them away. But a lot of times they'll still kind of like hang at that, like you were saying, kind of at the edge of measure, and they'll just kind of keep that distance. But very distance aware people, especially taller people who are distance aware, love to play this game, right? And so, I think with the Anonymous advice with that is, like, when you want to fight somebody who is very good at wide play, is to sort of use that same idea. And I think you sort of referenced this, or at least sort of alluded to this in your discussion, kind of leading to this point where, that changing step where you can almost give them a feinted step backwards. And I actually see that quite a bit in, even in Manciolino with some of his sword and large buckler plays, where it's like you give that aggressive step forward, and then the opponent, obviously we don't get what the opponent's doing, but your first action is that almost like you're going back to do that changing step, but what you're doing is you're almost kind of luring them to take that extra half step in. Maybe they do an accrescimento with their front foot, and then that extra you accressing back that half step is what makes them do a full pass, and then you can exploit that, kind of that idea.
I think that the mechanics of the changing step are important too, because they, if you've ever tried to kind of lure somebody in, and if you're stepping away is a fully honest stepping away, it's hard to take away the opponent's commensurate advance. So meaning, if I step away from you, and so if I give you a full honest step away and you go, okay, and you come forward, and then I go, oh, now I'm going to go at you, well, then you're free to immediately retreat from me again. And so whereas the kind of part of the mechanics that I think are really inherent in steps like changing steps are that it is a retreat that is, my body is already beginning to move back forward. So I'm able to, and when I'm teaching this, and I see it very much in like Manciolino more actually than Marozzo, is that when you're changing your feet in the changing step, you can be rotating your body so that your momentum actually continues back from a retreat back into a forward motion. So you kind of get like a little U shape of your kinetic energy. And so that allows you to lure the person in and step forward while they're following you. So I start to step away, and then you go, oh, he's going, and you start to come towards me, and I'm already entering back in on you. And I think that's something that's really important to the changing step.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think the other thing that I found too, and this is something that I've just started to explore with my sword and buckler students, is when you fight against somebody that just wants to retreat, to pressure them and to continue. I know this kind of defies Manciolino and the Anonymous advice here, but is to continue to pressure them with narrow play. Well, this fits with the Anonymous. You continue to pressure them with narrow play to get them going in those steps, and in the sequence of your attacks, pay attention to their steps until you get that right tempo where you can hit them with a wide play action. So this is kind of similar to the Anonymous advice where he says, if you're fighting somebody who's good at wide play, then you should act like you want to fight narrow and then hit them at wide play. So you give them the pressure and the feeling that you're going to chase them, and then you catch them in the step. Obviously with sword and buckler, it's easier to go for a lower target like the leg or something like that. With sword alone, you're probably going to go to a shallow target like the hand. But there are tempos that you can definitely start to create those opportunities and start to exploit those things as you're driving people.
Yeah, I think another part to pushing somebody is retreating first doesn't always get the reaction that you want, because sometimes somebody who, we think about the people that like Maurizio is describing, or, like if I retreat first, they might just be like, okay, see ya. Great, good. I was feeling a little bit of pressure there, and I'm happy that's off now. That there is a benefit to pushing your opponent, but not pushing them so much that they run away from you. I want to push them so that they retreat from me. And thinking that differently. So if somebody runs away from me, then they tend to fully exit. And so then they are their goal is to become completely clear of that situation. And then they will keep becoming clear of it until they can relax and then think about entering again. Then you just started from the beginning. Whereas sometimes I want to give the right amount of pressure to this person, that they retreat, but they don't leave the fight. Then I give them some ground so that they feel that the turnaround is occurring in the fight. And so, like in a very simple way, most people in their most basic sense of fighting have an attacking mode and a defending mode. And attacking modes typically involve forward movement, and defending modes typically involve retreating movement. And so I want to push a little bit, and then they'll feel that we've changed turns, that it's now their turn to move into attacking mode, and I'm going to be in retreating mode. But of course, I'm using something like a changing step. I'm giving just the artificial sense that I'm taking that off, so that when they change direction, when they go, oh, it's my turn now, and begin to riposte if they're aggressive, or begin to step back in to seek control, they're simply stepping into a renewed entry from me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So that's also a way that we can use that retreat in a way that I think Manciolino wouldn't have admonished us for being cowardly.
Right.
And also what I think we see in a lot of the assaulti, where you have this kind of pressure, and then at the ends, even with the, if there's an embellishment, but there tends to be kind of a forward and then a withdraw and then a re-forward. Like there's a lot of this like pressure, off, pressure, which to me is creating those moments where I can lure the other person to believe that the initiative is changing to them, and then retake it from them, take away that tempo of their entry or that tempo of their changing guard.
Cool.
That's excellent.
So the sources tell us that sword and small buckler was usually fought with a spotted ejoko or foil. What do you think the sword would have been like? Have you seen any examples that you think?
Yeah, Roberto Gatti has some.
Okay.
And I've seen the examples that I've seen that seem to fit into that. Some look like foiled weapons, so they have like narrowed, lighter swords, rounded ends. I've seen a few with like kind of oval ends.
Yeah.
And then there's some that there's some curators have said they don't look like they ever had. They looked to me like swords, but curators said they don't look like they ever had an edge, but they have damage. And so that's the other. So there's maybe just blunted swords is the other kind of thing that we're seeing. I often go back to these. It'll come to me here. There's an artist who's a caricature artist who did a bunch of, in the 1500s, did a bunch of these sort of funny drawings.
Cool.
And
okay.
he shows two people fighting with bird cages on their heads, holding. No, he's making fun of something, but he's making fun of people doing a particular thing, and they have basically giant backs of like potpourri on the end of their swords, and the swords also, I can't remember, I'd have to look back at the image, but the swords also are rebated, but he's making fun of it. So all these are exaggerations, but he's exaggerating something that is actually occurring. in his time. Okay. So that to me is one of the, there's often a lot of debate as to whether people wore modified helmets of any kind. That to me is one interesting data point, in that he's making fun of these people wearing bird cages on their heads. So it suggests to me that they're wearing he's making fun of people wearing some sort of like grill helmets.
Right. Okay.
And they have birds in the cages. It's I can find that artist. I think I'm trying to remember. Quintino keeps coming to mind, but it isn't Quintino. Quintino's the guy who tells you to do your rapier and dagger by putting your rapier between your knees and draw your dagger and throw it at them, and then while they're defending against the dagger, pull the sword out and stab them. That's Quintino. So also kind of a caricature of, but Quintino is being serious.
Is he also the guy that tells you when you're fighting a bear to stick your hand all the way in the bear's mouth?
I don't know. I've only read some small sections of Quintino. Quintino has does the defenses actually. So in other places, the dagger defense to roll on your back and put your feet in their chest and throw them, which seems to show up in a lot of manuals. Yeah. And Quintino says that's the only technique required. Okay. No other dagger techniques required. That's it.
So
excellent. Yeah,
he's
definitely
a streets guy, because he developed a pared down system.
Right, that's true. Okay, sorry. Apparently, we already knew the answer to this. A guy did come up with this pared down system. You just need this rapier dagger, throw the dagger, stab with the rapier thing, and this and the one dagger throw, and you're done. Neat. You're golden.
It's either that or he was doing Renaissance jiu-jitsu.
Right.
So one of the things I always thought was interesting is in Italian the word for foil is fioretto, which is basically a floret, like a flower bud.
Right.
Or like, the end of a piece of broccoli. So to me, it kind of suggests that at some point the standard came to have a bulb on the end of it, kind of like what you were saying.
Yes.
But I guess we'll never really know for sure.
Yeah, it'd be, Roberto, if you get a chance to take a look there, he has a whole collection in his museum about training equipment from various periods. Now, a lot of that tends to lean 1800s,
right?
But he does have some earlier foiled weapons.
Well, I'm sure it'd be great to take a trip out to Brescia.
Yeah.
It would work for our research, too.
Yeah.
We need to get out there, Stephen.
Yes, we do. All right.
We're going to spend a lot of time there. Before we get to that last question, actually, I've got one more.
Yeah.
So, Devon, when we're looking at Marozzo or with Manciolino, both authors put a lot of emphasis on the fact that they think that mezzospada and the plays and techniques that come from mezzospada are where the true art really lies, with even with fighting with the sword and small buckler. Both of them make pretty grandiose statements that, everything that leads up to this point, and, Marozzo even gives his sort of pedagogical approach to the way that he sets it up is, here's wide play, here's the transition between wide play and narrow play, here's when you're going from narrow play to mezzospada, and then of course with Manciolino in particular, he gives a lot of emphasis on his plays for the mezzospada, and even says, like, this is, again, where the true art lies. So how do you see that overall in its context, and how important that is, especially with something like sword and small buckler?
I think that, so to me, part of what's important about mezzospada is that it is not just about the place of that close proximal distance, but it is also the place where the weapon is not easily cleared. So when we're interacting with the points of the weapons, then I can do these fuller clearing actions and I can clear your weapon. Whereas when we cross at the middle sword, my weapon is going to remain there. And so I think that one aspect of why the true art lies there is, one is I think there's a lot more of the different degrees of feeling are required in the blade at that point. And we see that throughout Renaissance and medieval texts. That seems to be where everybody feels the art is, because that's what they spend so much of their time on, is on the binds. And so this is the place where you must bind, and the bind's quality is much more important, and there are many more degrees of it. It is, of course, also the place where the deadliness is much more there, because I can't exit from that situation as safely without still potentially being struck by my opponent.
Yeah,
so I think
Manciolino says something akin to, if you're in that place already, you should stay there, because it's better to get hit with the lower half of the sword than it is the the upper portion of the sword, right? So he's like, if you're gonna get hit, at least get hit with the non-deadly part, right? So I didn't mean to interrupt. But
no, that's great. I love that. That was a good addition. And so I think that when we say this is where the art is, I think we could think of that as being like, one way we could think of that is, where's the most flourish and the most, like all the breadth there. But it can also mean where's the greater subtlety, what requires the greatest level of artifice, of understanding in why, or what has the greatest importance. And that the place where, one, there's more greater level of feeling, the risk is much, much higher. The potential to transition between these two different distances, the distance, of the prese and the distance of moving away into largo play still is there. So there is actually greater tactical options that conceivably exist in that place, especially if you're on the bad side of it. I think that's, I think of it as often that's where the importance is. And where the importance is means that's where the subtlety and the greater level of awareness, and where students should dedicate a greater portion of their time if they're worried about their survival. So I think that's where what we're seeing there is that emphasis. And I also find, in my school, we spend a lot of our time in the foundational level on gioco stretto, spending time in binds, spending times gaining a greater awareness. And it is, I would say, the greater art is required. Not the greater flourish, not the greater breadth, but the greater capacity to be able to control your own weapon and your opponent's weapon exists at that space. And I found that it pays big dividends to have people spend a lot of time there first, because if you just leave people to their own devices to just fight as they will avoid that space, unless they're kind of boxed into it. They'll have just these fleeting moments of that space. And in those fleeting moments, they won't be able to learn enough to actually get good at it.
Yeah, that's actually, I think that's what's wrong with Hima's longsword scene, but that's just me personally. But it's interesting. Like when you were talking about that, I was kind of thinking about the fact that I lost the thought there.
I agree with you. I'll maybe comment on that one thing. Maybe it'll stimulate you. I agree. I think it's sword and buckler fighting in Hema. I think gioco stretto is missing in a lot of fighting in Hema, and in a lot of and I think there's a couple things. It is sometimes where the art is a place that is less intuitive, feels less common sense to people.
Right.
How extending your body over this greater lever of the blade of the extending from your hand, that is not intuitive to us as humans, how that interacts and how the edges interact with one another, and how those forces, how the weapons slide and collect into each other's hilts or not. All of those sorts of things do not come. That's, to me, is where the magic of the art is as well. And it's the thing that I think requires the greatest study and the greatest time to understand. And so in the greater Hema world, there's in a world where most people aren't good at that, you don't necessarily need to be good at it. And the person who manages their distance and their timing and can use some physical attributes down to a few core movements will be the victor for a long time.
So
one place I think. Go ahead. Sorry, you got your thought?
I did. I got it back.
All right.
Great.
So what I was thinking about when you were talking about that was actually Giganti. And it's the opposite problem, right? So in Giganti's second book, he talks about how if you have been training in the cell, which, given Giganti's work, we can imagine is a lot of gioco stretto, he says that you have to go out and you have to fight random people in the street, or at least, drunken people in the street, because you need to fight people who are going to try to strike you with natural blows. Right. And then that kind of, when I read that, my mind instantly went back to Marazzo, and where Marazzo's always like, they can give you a mandrito, a reverso, or a stoccata, and they're going to give you a mandrito, right? It's like these it's almost like there's a lot of emphasis and a lot of treatment in terms of how to move when it comes to wide play actions, kind of bring this back to sword and small buckler. But really, everything that you're doing from that range outside of what might be some sort of, I found in some ways what feel like some of these like hidden actions that might be like hidden ideas of defense that you're doing as you're going through some of the flourishes and embellishments, but that's an aside. But I guess it just feels like, that here are the natural blows, right? It's super easy. Like I even when I read Fiore, I get the same sense of here's the natural blows. You can give, you have your seven blows. All of them are relatively natural as long as they're going through the lines that they should be going through, and then you get all of his masters, and it's like when you get into the masters, you're like, oh, okay, now we're actually getting into the real art of what Fiore is trying to teach. But, all we really get in terms of how to deliver the individual blows is here's a segno.
Right. And that's the thing I also, earlier when I commented on the multi-intention nature of the Bolognese and said, it seems to be a system that gets that earlier. And then I corrected myself and said, well, actually, that's what they just present in their books. We don't actually really know whether they, we have some sense maybe from Marazzo's commentary about how long he says people should spend cutting before they so that suggests that there's some basics time of, just spending time cutting. But we don't always, it's hard to know how much time, how versed people are in the natural blows or in the system that comes before what's put down in the manuals. Right. Because the manuals are often showing us about the special moments, the moments where the magic is, where it takes a lot more study to get good. And I sometimes feel like actually that I don't feel like the HEMA world is necessarily ahistorical. I think that it's just very biased. Actually, it may not even be ahistorical in how it's biased, meaning most people out on the street, I think in the time of these people, were just whacking at you with the things that they found worked, and with a lot of natural blows, and some people have figured out some natural blows and some good tricks. Like I think that's actually quite historical. And all of these historical masters spend their time railing against people not doing proper, not doing la verde della destrezza. They're railing against people fighting in vulgar ways, and they're complaining about people fighting with overly long swords, and they're complaining about people relying just on speed and physical attributes, and it's all the same stuff that we complain about. It's quite the environment's very historical.
So one of the things I was always thinking is, so you were mentioning about how the sticks were sort of omnipresent in the area, and I was kind of thinking that they actually, being boys, probably grew up fighting with sticks. I mean, I don't know any boys that didn't, and I imagine at that time, without video games, they really would have been doing it because they had nothing better to do. And that I was always interested how the sword and small buckler material was almost like taking somebody who knows how to fight with sticks and introducing them to the magic of swords. Once you have edges colliding, and how you can basically develop thrusts with advantage and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it I think like right off of sticks.
Right. Yeah, you've already been doing a lot of kind of Gioco Largo actions with your sticks.
Right. So you kind of already have that. Yeah. And then maybe that's how they take that to Mezza Spada, where it gets more and more magical, as you say.
Right. And do you actually then also say, is there also kind of a class distinction there too, that that the magic is really in Gioco Stretto with real swords, not with sticks.
You're right.
Is that actually why I'm saying the magic is there?
Go back and play with your sticks, Giuseppe.
Right, exactly.
All right, so we're really interested in sword and small buckler this month because our October episode, we're looking at the duel, the beginning of the duel between two famous Bolognese warriors, Guido Rangoni, who we mentioned before, and Hugo Popoli. We also know that they're the same age and were probably fighting with sword and small buckler as boys. We know that Guido was short and that Hugo was tall. How might these two fencers have approached the fight differently? And can you think of any specific attacks from the Bolognese canon or system that would have been suitable for either one? I know.
Now we know also that Guido was like a ferocious guy, so
he was towering in valor, if not in height.
That's right.
So I certainly feel like one thing from what I've read about him is that he certainly made up. And I think that's something, the making up for your stature with your presence.
Right.
I think is an important quality of to bring to that fight. So when we think, if we've talked about the smaller, the taller and shorter fighters idea already here. Right. I think there's a whole other side here, which is, and I think this is something that gets talked about, and I feel like it's a part of kind of Guido, is how do you dominate that fight psychologically? How do you make the tall fighter into a shrinking violet?
Got it. All right. Well, let's look at that.
Them,
how do you do that?
Have them, I think that's something that is in the Bolognese kind of corpus as well, and it's talked about in the I think that idea is talked about in the Italian tradition, both in the sense of the introductions to the plays, coming out, showing, an embellishment. That's part of presence, bringing presence into the fight. It's part of a way I see that as a tool. I see there's a lot of different tools there, but one of them is how do you bring and dominate this situation before you even enter it? How do you hide your intention about when you're going to enter it and how? But there's also the other place where it's talked about is in commentary on the bestial man. So, the bestial man is also the person who is trying to take on the airs of that I have a dominant presence. They're doing they're doing the embellishment, but they don't. The secret is that they don't have any technique at all. They're only the bestial and not the skilled person.
Right.
But I don't. I think that so Guido Rangoni, I think his, the main thing that he would do, and I think is important, is he did a lot to control that space psychologically before he entered it. Okay. Tried to be the person with the greater presence. And I think that there is a real power there against somebody who's maybe could be outstatured by the other person, is to, use your embellishment, use your make the other person really believe that you're going to end them. And that the power of your blows are going to be something that they will need to really put their body up to withstand. And then when you enter, come with a greater degree of finesse than they're expecting.
So basically do your embellishments with an attitude. So come in banging your buckler, making them think that you're going to do that to their face.
Right, it could be that. And I think that there's lots of ways that one can come in with attitude. And sometimes you can come in with attitude just by how you carry your body and how resolutely you enter towards the engagement. Okay. And so if you come very resolutely and very strongly towards engagement, that can create one thing. If you come with powerful blows within your embellishment, and I don't think you're not making it look like I'm just doing a little, I think one thing that happens with modern practitioners is they do something that kind of looks like a little show. Bring a little show, and now I've arrived, and here we do this. As opposed to, I am just beginning the violence immediately.
Right.
And I am now bringing the violence to you.
Right.
And so when I embody that I'm coming with all of this violence, this wave is building and is going to crash onto you. And I think that the powerful thing there is the bestial man has only that. They don't even want to enter. They want to resolve the situation only with their presence. Whereas the skilled swordsman comes with that degree of presence, but then they pick their moment that they enter very, very well. They don't just go for the violent blow right away. They've maybe created the impression that they're going to end you. As soon as they enter their measure, they're going to hit you. So Guido's going to come in appearing to take and occupy that space. Like he's just going to leap across that distance and strike strike Hugo with a single game-ending blow. But then instead he makes an attack to miss, a feint that then comes back to the sword, and then he makes his entry. So I think that's part of also how you're not only using an introduction embellishment to disguise when you're going to attack, you're also using it, or to how you're going to attack, you're using it to disguise even the intention of the nature of what your attacks will be like at all.
Okay. Got it. So you kind of, that makes sense. All right.
Now, I think Hugo, so when you're dealing with somebody who comes with a tremendous, now I've just set up this scenario, so imagine everybody coming.
We can picture Guido coming in, glowering, nasty.
And I think this is something that we encounter in Hemaspace too. I certainly have a lot of students who go out and they meet somebody who's coming with a lot more bestiality or a lot more violence than they bring, than they in their spirit bring. Certainly one way we can train ourselves to try to match that level of presence with our own. And I think that there's benefit to doing that. So, Hugo could choose to see if he can come, and this is a very Italian feeling in a lot of ways, to see if he, in fact, has an even greater presence than Guido does. And they can come and both build their tidal waves toward one another. And then it is, really comes down to who can deceive the other to cross the distance in the time that is not expected and take advantage of that scenario.
Okay.
So there's one way of doing that is I come with that same violence and then I'm just trying, or a lot of HEMA tournaments, people come with equal violence and they both enter as hard as they possibly can, both of them hoping that they're the harder one of the other.
Never seen that before.
And we know there's commentary of a lot of Italian duels that was how that many Italians did enter against each other in that way.
Just
that they
both trying to be
equal
dominant
levels of violence, and they both struck each other. And there's lots of duels where people got hit and stabbed and cut many, many times because they clearly were coming with that same idea.
Okay.
But I think the smarter approach, I would advise Hugo to maybe come with some degree of feeling of the meeting, but then seek to kind of tease the edge of that measure. Fake his entry into that measure, try to cue Guido to come violently earlier than he intends, and to try to keep that distance and outfence him just on kind of managing his space. But he has to manage his space while keeping his body still forward. I think that the risk is to cower away, to yield away. And so he's gone. The other thing I often recommend is I would say, Hugo should probably take as much ground as he can as early as possible in the fight so that he gives himself more space to maximize the advantage of reach.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds like a great breakdown. I'm picturing lots of montante from Hugo, lots of big old whirling blows. It makes it look like he's going to enter with a montante thrust, but then he turns it back up to Guardia Alta, trying to lure Guido in. And Guido, that sort of makes sense. Like he's trying to steal that distance, kind of like you're saying, but also intimidate him so that he thinks he's going to be clumsy and desperate.
Mm-hmm. And I think it is when we choose to receive someone in fighting, we need to make sure that there's still a forward presence to our reception. I think the thing that sometimes happens when people are allowing the fight to come to them, which isn't a bad idea, is that they allow too much. They retire too much. And so then they actually really are behind on that initiative. Whereas when we're going to receive in a fight, we're actually coming with the intention of stealing. And stealing is a very active and aggressive mindset.
Analogy.
It just creates the impression of reception. But it is a type of counter-aggression.
Right. Yeah, like we're going to hit them. We're just going to let them extend their sword first so we can set it aside when we hit them.
Right. One thing I do to help myself, and I give this trick to my students too, when I'm going to be working in a more receptive-oriented place, I imagine, even if I'm going to wait for them to come to me, I imagine that I am moving forward still. The reason the distance is collapsing is I'm moving forward. Okay. It just happens to be that their legs are propelling that collapse of distance.
Cool.
But I'm still the one controlling it. I'm still the agent of that distance collapse.
Nice.
Yeah, I think, so bringing this back to Manciulino, again, my muse here, he speaks of defending going forward. And for a while, that was always something that was very puzzling to me. But then as I started to really study his sword and small buckler material, really started to look at his mezzospada techniques and everything like that, it started to click to me a little bit that that's really what his intention was, right? So you talk about stealing, and I almost feel like that's where those mezzospada techniques really, really start to shine, is where you can, you take the initial one or two blows that come from your opponent as if you were reading Manciulino's book 1, where you might get a first or second intention attack. But then on that second intention attack, if you can catch with good defense, then you can naturally transition into the mezzospada techniques and really take somebody out. And a lot of times it's because you're working around their person. You're either getting to their outside or their inside line in a way where you can sort of express your dominance. And I see that a lot with, kind of bringing this back to the sharp discussion. with his book 4, when he's doing sword and large buckler, that's how I actually see those progressions really start to play out. You're giving 1 or 2 defenses where you're taking care of that initial thrust. You're taking care of the fact that they've tried to bring their sword back online with a cut of some kind, or perhaps they've attacked a low target, and then you're instantly transitioning once you've kind of regained control, or at least it's the moment to steal the initiative back. Then you're transitioning back into something that starts to transition into what, at least from my perspective, I start to see is looking a lot more like Mezzospada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you're getting to that space, we're also getting into mezzo tempo, which is one of the kind of earliest types of tempo that's mentioned by Italian people like Manciolino. This idea of hitting people in the middle, of their actions. And that's something that you get a lot. Well, there's ways you get that in gioco largo and open and wide play, but you don't force it. The opponent has to give it to you. Whereas, or at least not as easily do you force it. Whereas when you get into gioco stretto alla mezzospada, now I can obstruct my opponent. I can stringere my opponent in a way that forces them to move in larger action, and then I can take those larger movements with half actions. And so that's something that we ideally all, that's something that Italian fencing starts to move quite sharply towards, is this idea of trying to get into these narrow measures where you have control and you can strike your opponent in mezzo tempo.
Yeah, I see that with his core of defense as well too. I've started to see Manciolino's defensive box being his, obviously a falso from Porta di Ferro stretta, right? So you're raising up into Guardia di Faccia, either that or you're going into Guardia di Testa, and then Guardia di Testa naturally leads to that mezzo mandrito, which covers that inside line, and you can transition between those 3 specific guards going between those actions, right? Like you think about his sword alone plays a parry, that false edge parry that goes up into Guardia di Faccia, and then the mandrito comes, you go into Guardia di Testa to make the parry, so that way you can cut the mandrito back across the arms. It's like he's got this little tight box that he likes to work from, that he then explores, and it's usually starting to work on the outsides and working around.
Yeah, the single sword plays that's where he has that kind of universal parry paradigm that's that shows up a lot. And that is, the idea there is to stringere your opponent into this very narrow set of options, so that your actions are and you are going to be moving towards mezzo tempo if you get close enough, just by virtue. And that's, again, back to that, why is the art in the gioco stretto alla mezzospada? Part of that is because you need to be able to see the smaller tempos and be able to act in those smaller tempos, and that takes a lot of ability.
Right, I think we got sword and buckler down, huh?
I think so. Yeah, that was a great discussion.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
And that concludes another episode of L'Arte dell'Armi, the Bolognese podcast. I want to thank Devon Boorman again for coming on and sharing his wisdom about sword and small buckler. In the next episode of L'Arte dell'Armi, we're going to learn all about side sword manufacturers. Have you ever wondered how your side sword ranks in terms of the pantheon of side swords available? Well, this will be the episode to find out, at least from Stephen and I's perspective. It's a little subjective, of course, as all things are, and we hope you enjoy it. After that, we're going to be doing episode 2 of Maestro Wars, and we're going to find out what happens in the epic of Guido Rangone and Ugo Pepoli. So stay tuned for that, and stay saucy, my friends.